Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Jackson, and the focus is rough upbringing. Andrew Jackson was born March 15, 1767. He was the third son of Elizabeth and Andrew Jackson. They lived in the Waxhaw district, right on the border of North and South Carolina, but it was without his father. He never met his father, who died 3 months before he was born. There were tough times for the Jackson family. There was really no income coming in, and so they had to move into his mother's sister's home with her husband and their 8 children. What was Jackson known for? Well, he was known as a wild kid. He cursed a lot, played practical jokes, chewed tobacco. He had very little formal education, and like spelling in particular vexed him his entire life. But mostly people knew Andrew Jackson was not someone that you messed with, and if you did, you better watch out for what happened in return. In one case, his friends decided to play a practical joke on him. They loaded up a shotgun all the way to the muzzle with shot just to see Jackson shoot it and have fall on his backside. And that's exactly what happened. So what did Jackson do? He leaped to his feet and said, "By God, if one of you laughs, I'll kill him." And Andrew Jackson very likely meant it, not figuratively, but literally. This was Jackson's way. If you came after him, you better expect him to come back after you even more. And sometimes that meant the threat of death, as you would see throughout the rest of his life. Well, there was a lot of death going on at the time because this was the period of the American Revolution in Jackson's early teenage years. The revolutionary fighting had actually moved from the north down into the southern part of the country, where North and South Carolina were both sort of right in the middle of things. Jackson and his family were very much aligned with the American rebels, although there were a lot of loyalists in the Carolinas as well. So a lot of conflict going on. The American Revolution was very costly for the Jackson family. His older brother Hugh was killed in battle fighting for the Americans in the Continental Army, and he and his brother Robert, who were younger, too young to actually engage as soldiers, but they were still sympathetic and supportive. Jackson in particular, around the age of 14, was often running messages on behalf of the American soldiers. Well, one time he and Robert were actually taking some pot shots at the British from afar when they were spotted and traced down to his cousin's home, where they were subsequently captured. In fact, there was an altercation in the cabin where the British officer in charge ordered Jackson to clean his boots. Well, Andrew Jackson simply and defiantly said no. He's a prisoner of war, and that is not a responsibility for a prisoner of war. So what did that officer do? He took his sword and jammed it down into the head of Andrew Jackson, who slightly deflected it but got a big gash on his forehead, something that he carried with him, likely with pride, for the rest of his life. Well, they did become prisoners of war, and they were taken to a camp that was filthy. Smallpox was running rampant, and by the time their mother came and actually arranged their release, Robert was near death. Andrew was really ill from smallpox. In fact, by the time they got back home, Robert died 2 days later. Andrew Jackson did recover, but he was certainly suffering from that illness, and again, the family continued to suffer of these losses, and there was one more loss to come. Jackson's mother didn't just want to get them released. Some of her nephews were also being held on prison ships by the British, and so she was bound to try to get their release as well. And she went off by herself, became inflicted with cholera, and died on the way home. Andrew Jackson was only 14 years old at the time. His father, mother, both brothers gone. He was essentially completely alone. His mother left a lasting memory for Andrew Jackson in a note of sort of ideas and things that he should follow for this course of his life. And a couple of the elements included, to forget an obligation or be ungrateful for a kindness is a base crime. Not merely a fault or a sin, but an actual crime. Men guilty of it, sooner or later, must suffer the penalty. She added, avoid quarrels as long as you can without yielding to imposition, but sustain your manhood always. And then she said at the end, if you ever have to vindicate your feelings or defend your honor, do it calmly. If angry at first, wait till your wrath cools before you proceed. Jackson wasn't very good at that last one, but he considered these last words to be the law of his life, and many of them he in fact really followed to the letter, to an extreme point in some cases. Well, Jackson fuddled around with some odd jobs. He was even a local teacher for the time before he decided to study the law. And he became apprenticed to a lawyer by the name of Spruce McKay in Salisbury, North Carolina. And Jackson certainly made a name for himself. But it had nothing to do with being a lawyer in Salisbury. One of his contemporaries mentioned that Jackson was the most roaring, rollicking, game-cocking, card-playing, mischievous fellow that ever lived in Salisbury. That was Andrew Jackson. Well, Jackson passed the bar. Business was pretty slow. There wasn't a lot for him to do, but he picked up an offer from a friend who had just become named to a judge in the Western District of North Carolina, which is the present state of Tennessee. And Jackson was given the opportunity to be the prosecutor. The judge had that authority to name him, and Jackson said yes. Now, this area was mostly Indian country. It was pretty dangerous country, in fact. There were only a couple of large towns in the whole area, in Knoxville and Nashville. But Jackson said, let's do it. Let's head west. It's 1788. He's only 21 years old, and he's off on a new adventure. Well, he actually did quite well. He, as a prosecutor, his public duties were going well, and he had no restrictions, so he could hang out his own shingle, take on his own clients, and things were off to a pretty good start. But the big impact for Andrew Jackson in this period was meeting Rachel Donelson. She had a lot in common with Jackson. They were both pretty wild. They loved dancing and parties, having fun. The problem was Donaldson was married. She was married to a man named Louis Robards, and it was a miserable marriage, and she wanted out. In fact, they had been living in Virginia, and she left him to come back home to this area in the Western District. But divorce was very difficult in this time. It actually took an act of the state legislature and a finding of the courts before a divorce could be finalized. And Robards initially didn't want a divorce. He came to go get Rachel and try to make things work. But she eventually made it clear she wasn't going back to him. The answer was no. And so Robards decided that he would actually pursue the divorce. Well, Rachel and Donaldson and Andrew Jackson at this point became very, very close. They wanted to get married. They didn't want to wait for this divorce, so they didn't. They decided to go to Spanish-held Natchez, about 500 miles away, and elope, where they started living together as husband and wife. And it was only later that they learned that the divorce had actually finally gotten through both the legislature and the state courts. And so they took their vows again. But they had clearly been living married together for quite some time, and this was something that would become political fodder for Jackson's enemies later on in his life. Rachel was the most powerful bond in Jackson's life. She was everything to him. He was completely devoted to her. In fact, if you wanted to get on Jackson's bad side, say one word about Rachel, and he was going to come at you in spades. Now, unfortunately, most of their correspondence was destroyed in a fire in their home in the 1830s, but some of the letters did survive, including one that was representative of the affection that Jackson had for his wife when he said, "My dearest heart, it is with the greatest pleasure I sit down to write you. Though I am absent, my heart rests with you. With what pleasing hopes I view the future period when I shall be restored to your arms, there to spend my days in domestic sweetness with you, the dear companion of my life." This was after many years of marriage, and this sense of closeness and bond with Rachel was something that was part of his life from really the time that they first met. Well, at this period, Andrew Jackson got his first job in the military. 25 years old, at 1792, he becomes the Judge Advocate General in the Tennessee Militia. And he also got his start in politics. He became friendly with the governor of the state, William Blount, who was actually the governor of the territory, became governor of the state when Tennessee became a state. And at that point, Blount helped Jackson become the first congressman from the state of Tennessee. So he was off to Philadelphia for the capital of the country. He spent about a year in the House of Representatives, and then he got a new job. He was elevated to the U.S. Senate. He, at this point, had just turned 30 years old, and he took up, which was the legal age necessary in the Constitution, and he took on those responsibilities in the Senate, and he absolutely hated it. He did not like being a legislator. He resigned after 3 months in the Senate, which he felt was all about endless debate, nothing ever getting anywhere. He was a man of action. He did his duty, but he was done. He was ready to go home. So he's back with Rachel, back in Tennessee, working their farm. Of course, they had plenty of slaves to help. Andrew Jackson was an unapologetic slaveholder his entire life. He would increase those holdings throughout his life. But he was also now a man of high respect in the state, and he got another job which elevated his stature even more. He became a judge on the state's Superior Court. He was very popular as a judge, in part because he was no nonsense. He was decisive. His rulings came down quick and clear, and once again, he was not one to mess with. There's the anecdote about Russell Bean, who was a giant of a man who had injured his son in one of his drunken frolics. And he was brought into court to face Judge Jackson and the jury, and Bean cursed out the judge, cursed out the jury, and ran out of court. Jackson told the sheriff to go get that man, bring him back into court. The sheriff went out and he couldn't do it. He wasn't able to bring Bean back in, who was cursing up a storm and shooting off in the air rounds of fire. And so Jackson, the judge, said, go find a posse and bring him back. They tried to get a posse together, and that was insufficient to bring Bean back into court. So what did Jackson do? He said, sheriff, deputize me. I will go get this villain. And that's exactly what happened. Judge Jackson, now deputized, went out into the public square where he found Bean creating all kinds of menace to the neighboring members of the community. And he walked up to him with his guns showing, and he said, now surrender, you infernal villain, this very instant, or I'll blow you through. And Bean surrendered. The next day, people asked him, why'd you give in to the judge as opposed to anybody else who came after you? And Bean said, why, when he came up, I looked him in the eye and I saw shoot. And there wasn't shoot in nary other eye in the crowd. So I says to myself, says I, hoss, it's about time to sing small. And so I did. Turns out that Russell Bean was an excellent judge of character. Otherwise, it likely would have been the last mistake he ever made. Part of the main message about Andrew Jackson in his first 30 plus years of life was don't mess with him. And that was a theme that would carry forward throughout the rest of his life in Stories for Another Day. That is Andrew Jackson and his rough upbringing from the life of Andrew Jackson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.